Good evening. I'm Bill Pegg and I chair Cupar Development Trust, and I extend now a formal sincere welcome to everybody, whether you're joining us from Fife or from other parts of Scotland, other parts of the UK, or way beyond, as we have already welcomed. All of us who've been involved in this event are absolutely delighted that you're able to be with us in such numbers. A little housekeeping, if I may, first, ahead of the lecture. I mentioned just now our Zoom host, Simon Baldwin, of Cupar Now, which is our town's unique digital improvement district, is recording the event for our archive. During the lecture, all bar our speaker himself will be muted with video turned off, and your questions should be shared via the chat facility, which is usually at the bottom of a Zoom screen, and will be put to Cyrian during the question and answer session after his lecture. A wee bit of background. Cupar is a small market town, a former royal borough. In the past half-century, it has suffered the closures of civil and criminal courts, a GCHQ facility, Scotland's only sugar beet factory, its major agricultural market, elements of its further education college, and several local authority headquarters. It has a population of less than 10,000 and continues to serve a hinterland of other towns, villages, and hamlets known informally as Cupar District. This is a caring community, as was proved from the start of the pandemic by the collaboration among numerous local organizations, all determined to play their part in mitigating the problems caused by COVID and then contributing to recovery from it. That is the background to this important event. We're immensely privileged to have a lecturer of Cyrian Boyd's stature. As you know his pedigree from what we've sent out before today, and I shall not delay Cyrian by repeating it. The two key parts of his pedigree are that he leads on climate change in the University of St Andrews and on
You're muted, Bill.
You're muted, Bill.
Since when? Hello?
You were just saying that I was leading climate change at the University of St Andrews.
And somebody muted me now. There's somebody.
That's
got
right.
Power. Yes. Well, I'll start that again, because the two really key parts of Ian's pedigree for tonight are that he leads on climate change in the University of St Andrews and on resilience in the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scotland's National Academy, whose post-COVID Futures Commission unveiled its report as recently as 2 days ago. I have great pleasure now in inviting Cyrian Boyd to deliver the Cupar District Annual Lecture 2021, the title being Environmental Shocks and Resilient Communities.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm going to share my screen. I hope all this works. Is that now shared? Have we got it shared?
Yes, it is on mine, Ian. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
The best view for people to use.
Thank you very much for the. Sorry, Bill, go on.
I was just going to say the best view for people to use is top right. It says side by side speaker, and then you get you on one side of the screen and your slides on the other.
Great, thank you very much, Bill, and thank you for the introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to meet you all, even if it's online. I know there was a plan at some point to try to get this in person, but that didn't quite work out. I'm hoping that at some point in the future we will be back nearer to normal, and maybe we could sort of pick that up later on. As Bill said, the title of this talk is Environmental Shocks and Resilient Communities. How a 21st century market town can be sustainable to the benefit of all. Now, I'm going to be absolutely clear that I know quite a lot about environmental shocks. I know quite a lot about resilience, but I'm not actually a big expert in communities. And I don't know a lot about market towns. And I think there are a lot of people on this listening to this lecture who probably know an awful lot more about me than me about market towns. So I have to caveat what I'm going to say at the beginning based on my background and my knowledge. I'm also come at this from a very analytical type of perspective because I'm a scientist, and I bring a particular point of view which might be actually quite different from some other points of view. I'm a natural scientist. I'm not a social scientist, and social scientists might take a slightly different view to me. But one of the great strengths of some of the things that I'm involved in is that we mix up those different sciences and we come to joint conclusions. And Bill mentioned the Royal Society of Edinburgh's work on post-COVID futures. And within that, there was a very significant mix of different perspectives, all of which have been synthesized into a report which was published on Monday. So what I'd like to do through this talk is, and I'll just move my slides on, there we go, is provide you with some discussion under 3 headings here. The first 2 of these headings, what I call the problem and chronic emergencies and then acute emergencies, is really for wider context about how we actually deal with crises and how communities like Cupar, like a Royal Borough, might operate. A lot of what I'm going to say actually applies at the level of a Royal Borough, but it also applies at individual household level, and it applies at national level as well, and even at international level. Part of my scientific background is in the study of what's called scale-free complex processes, and actually you can actually apply the same principles at all these different scales in order to be able to build resilience into communities. So what I'd like to try to do is paint a picture for you of how that can be rationalized, so that you, in your own context, which you know much better than I do, can take that away and perhaps use it to help you make specific decisions about Royal Boroughs or local communities or whatever it might be that you're particularly interested in. So what I'll do first of all is have a look at what I would call the problem. Now, my background is as a scientist, but also as a chief scientific advisor within government. And one of the reasons, one of the functions that I had in government was to take a big, broad brush view and to look out into the future and to bring that view back into government. And the reason why somebody like me was asked to do that is that fundamentally in government, very few people do that. Most people are trying to firefight most of the time, manage short-term problems. In government, I sometimes felt I was the only person looking more than about 18 months ahead. Now, that's not strictly true, but I think the reality is that in many parts of government, very few people put their eyes to the horizon and try to understand what is coming at us in the long term. And when I mean the long term, I mean on a 10 to 20 to 30 year time horizon. Politics and government doesn't normally work on those types of horizons. I would also say that this lecture is coming at an opportune time when we've got COP26 coming up in Glasgow, and it's a really good illustration, actually, the management of climate, about how we have to take a very long-term view of things. And the reason for that is illustrated in this slide. And I'm going to move my cursor over the slide. Bill or Simon, can you see my cursor moving there? Good. Okay.
Yes, we do. Yep.
That's great. Brilliant. So I can guide your eyes through across the slide. If you just look at the this section here at the moment, when you step back from society overall and look at a national level, there are a number of what one could call strategic challenges. And there's another way of describing these as slow-moving emergencies. I've listed off 6 here, and I think these are the main ones, to be quite frank. These are the ones that, as a chief scientific advisor in government, I was most concerned with. There were ones that were more concerning to me, and others in government picked them up. People like Chris Whitty was dealing with some of them as well. So. And I'll just go through each of them just to try and set the overall scene. The non-communicable disease problem is one which is really driven by lifestyle. We have a modern lifestyle which is not conducive to necessarily to healthy living. It's often illustrated by obesity. And the kind of diseases that go alongside that, that is one of the biggest concerns that sits within the health community, health science community at the moment, because in the end it will swamp our health system if we don't get that under control, and that needs long-term treatment. It's not something that you can just pump money into in the short term and hope that it's going to go away. That's a whole attitude change and a values change within society. The next one is emerging and exotic diseases. And we've had just an excellent illustration of that, really challenging illustration of that over the last 18 months to 2 years with COVID-19. COVID-19 was an entirely predictable event. We didn't know when it was going to happen precisely, or what it would look like precisely, but we knew that an exotic disease was going to hit the population at some point or other in the not too distant future, and it's happened. We've been actually rather fortunate in that the disease that hit us, COVID-19, didn't kill very many people. There are a lot of other diseases out there that could have killed a much larger number of people and would have been much more difficult to manage. So that's a continuous issue that needs to be addressed. The next item, which I'm going to expand on a little bit more, is food, water, and air of the future. Now, food, water, and air may be things that you think of as being, well, they're just there. We take them for granted, but we shouldn't take them for granted, because actually they are the basis of life. We cannot live without high quality food, without clean water and clean air. And increasingly, less so in the UK, but certainly in many other parts of the world, food is not of high quality or is relatively scarce. Water can be of very low quality indeed, and air can be extremely low quality. And we have some of those problems in the UK. Air quality is not good in certain parts of the UK. In general, water quality and food quality are good. They are not guaranteed, and our food supply system is extremely vulnerable to shocks. During COVID-19, it was one of the biggest concerns that the food supply system would fail. It didn't, but it was a close run thing on occasions. The next one is resource depletion. That may be something that many people may feel is rather remote, don't fully understand it. But if I can point to the diagram on the left, this is the domestic extraction of resources. There's an equivalent one for non-domestic extraction, but it shows exactly the same pattern. It's the pattern I want to show here. The different colors are for biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals. But all of them show increases, and it's not just an increase; it's an exponential increase. It's been going on since since really the start of industrialization, but it's continuing and it's accelerating. This is something that I think that people don't fully engage with. Is that some of our biggest problems are actually associated with consumption, and the next item on the list is waste. The reality is that waste is produced as a result of the resources we consume. It's a system in balance. If we take something in, then it comes out the other end of the economy, and that comes out the end of the economy as waste. It's sometimes solid waste in the form of the kind of trash we put out from household waste. Or building waste or whatever it might be, but it's also gaseous waste, which includes carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. So fundamentally, the rise in waste that we have and the pollution it causes is driven by the amount of materials we absorb into the economy, and that is going up all the time. And just to give you an illustration of how fast it's going up, in the years 2010 to 2013, China used more cement than the United States did in the whole of the 20th century. So that gives you an idea of how much it's accelerating. And also things like cement and sand are actually quite a good illustration of how much resource is being used. And even things like building sand are becoming quite scarce, at least close to the sources, or close to the points of use. So we are, there is actually quite a lot of evidence to suggest that we are becoming resource constrained. We see it to some extent in the cost of gas prices at the moment. I think that is something that we've got to get used to in the future, where we will have spikes in prices of basic materials and basic commodities, just simply because there are supply shortages, some of which are driven by the fact that these materials are becoming more and more scarce. Of course, there is politics behind that, there's geopolitics behind it, but that geopolitics is really being driven off the back of the fact that some of these materials are not as abundant as we'd all like them to be. And just to add to the challenge there, China is intentionally trying to dominate the source of supply for most of those types of materials. So there's a significant security challenge, a security of supply challenge there, which is a problem. And with regard to waste, as I said, the amount of waste we produce is directly driven by the amount of material we consume. But waste is becoming toxic within the environment, and that toxicity expresses itself in a very wide range of different ways, from everything from the poor air quality we have to global warming, climate change, to things like polysaturated hydrocarbons that leak into the ocean and are highly stable compounds, but are very toxic, that are partitioned into the fats of tissues of things like fish. So if you go onto the Department of Health's website, it says don't eat fatty fish more than once a week. The reason for that is that actually eating it more than once a week, you would potentially get a toxic dose of some of these compounds. So that is an illustration of the kind of direction of travel that we're going in. And climate change is at the bottom here. Climate change is really a consequence of consumption. But nevertheless, it's something that obviously, as a result of the kind of consequences of climate change, we have to try to manage directly as well. And just to finish on where some of these chronic challenges sit, let me take you to the diagram on the bottom right here. This is a slightly complex diagram, but it shows different sectors of our economy. At the top is agriculture, fisheries, forestry and fisheries. Then there's manufacturing, energy and water, construction, transport and communication, other services, wholesale and retail, public administration, finance and business. It's pretty obvious here where the biggest bar is, but what does the bar mean? Well, the bar means tons of material consumed per million or billion pounds of GVA, that's gross value added. It's an economic way of saying how efficient, how material efficient different parts of the economy are. And the bigger the bar, the more inefficient they are. And I'm illustrating this because this is one of the areas that I was particularly interested in and particularly responsible for in government. And what you can see here is that the top bar, which is agriculture, forestry and fishing, and it is almost all agriculture, forestry and fishing are really small parts of this, are extraordinarily inefficient. So the food that we consume, this really important part of our sustainability, for sustaining life, is produced with extraordinary inefficiency. It's about 4 to 5 times less resource efficient than manufacturing and energy and water, for example. What's more, the real concern here is that while manufacturing, energy and water are continually showing efficiencies, in other words, they're becoming better and better at losing less and less resource for getting the same value out, agriculture is not. Agriculture has not increased in its efficiency for about the last 30 years, despite the fact that we spent an immense amount on research to try and do that. And that's why, one of my big clarion calls is that we have to transform the way we produce food. If we do not transform the way we produce food and do it quickly, probably by the middle of the century, to get its efficiency somewhere down towards where manufacturing is now, in other words, about 4 to 5 times more efficient than it is at the moment, then we will suffer a huge consequence, because actually the land that we use for producing food cannot be used for other things. And that includes storing carbon, it includes biodiversity, and it also includes the health and welfare of people. And it cannot produce the services that we need for producing clean water and cleaning our air and those sorts of things as a result. So we have a massive nexus of problems sitting here. I'd like to now move to trying to examine the way that we in society try to deal with these problems. So this is me trying to, as a natural scientist, trying to be a bit more of a social scientist to try to understand how we tackle them. We have what I call, I think, 3 competitive discourses going on in society. And some of you may recognize these, some of you may align with them. I think we all align with them at different times and in different subjects up to a point. But I'll just go through each of them to describe them. And I hope that you might kind of recognize them. I'll start with this one, which I call the tragedy discourse. And it is called the tragedy discourse because it actually espouses what's called the tragedy of the commons, which is a way of saying that actually, if we don't organize ourselves properly, we will use up all the resources we have. It was a chap called Garrett Harding in the 1960s came up with this idea based on the use of common land, that unless common land is properly managed, then everybody uses it and it gets absolutely trashed. And fundamentally, the tragedy discourse says that's what we're doing to the planet at the moment. We have a global commons, and that global commons is being overexploited by us. And just to illustrate, even in Scotland, we use more than twice the amount of basic resource that we would be using if we were sustainable. So we use about 18 tons of basic materials a year, each individual in Scotland. We need to get that to 8 tons to be sustainable. And that's roughly what we can deliver to everybody on the planet. And of course, in other countries, particularly the United States, the amount of material is 2 to 3 times what we consume in Scotland. I mean, it shouldn't make us feel good because we're actually well over what we are due as our fair share of global resources. And the tragedy discourse says that if we go on doing that, we will not just run out of resources, we'll run out of basically living space for people. And of course, there will be winners and losers in that, serious winners and losers. So that's where you get the Greta Thunbergs and others of the world sort of sit in this category here. People who are demonstrating by blocking roads in London and places like that. But actually, I think there's a lot of people who are not necessarily activists who actually also sit in that category. And I identify with that myself. And some of you may do too. You may not be out demonstrating about the climate emergency and those sorts of things, but you may well feel that actually we've got to do something to change the way we live. And it's a values-based argument. It's about how literally how we live is not compatible with sustainability in the planet. I'll move next to this dialogue, this discourse, which I call the adaptation discourse. And the adaptation discourse is usually proposed by, I think I will call them liberal economists, because actually what they espouse is the fact that we are an imaginative organism with fantastic powers and capabilities, some of which have been illustrated wonderfully during COVID-19 when we developed vaccines really quickly, and that we have a capability of, mainly through science and invention, digging ourselves out of the hole that we're in. It's not saying that we're not in a hole, it's saying that actually if we really apply ourselves and have our backs to the wall, we can dig ourselves out of this problem. And that's about adapting to the situation that we find ourselves in. And it's about delivering high quality, inventive science in order to be able to do that. And even in the budget today, the amount of money that is going to be spent on science over the next few years has been not quite, but nearly doubled. So to some extent, the government believes in this, that we can actually dig ourselves out of the hole through our inventiveness. And it's about a technology revolution. And you know, I talked about farming and about the fact that we have to have new technologies for food production, and we have to transform the food production to a very, very different way of working from the way we have at the moment. We can't continue to plough fields in the way we do and expect that it's actually going to produce the food we need in the future without other consequences. So that's there's I think there's quite a lot of people sit in that bracket. Then I'll move to the final discourse, which I call the sustainability discourse. You could call it a survivalist discourse, but it's a sustainability discourse, and that's a discourse which is kind of business as usual. If we just modify business as usual a bit, and we do a bit more here and a bit more there, we're going to solve the problem. And I've put this diagram up, which is actually representative of the Sustainable Development, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You could also point to the World Bank and how it works, as you know, in terms of providing funding for developing nations, leveling up, all those sorts of things. So there's a discourse that says, well, if we just invest in the kind of efficiencies that we would get, then we can sort this out. And there is evidence that might work. Most of the increase in the efficiency of food production over the last 20 to 30 years has not been because we've been able to increase the amount of food we get from every square meter of land that we cultivate. It's because of the global food system, because of how we trade food. We tend to grow food where it grows best, and then we move it around the world to the markets that need it most. And we've become very, very efficient at that. So there is an argument that says actually more of that is what we need. But is it enough? Is the question. And I think that most governments sit in this category at the moment, and most of the governments that are coming to COP 26 are very much in this category. It's let's not change things too much. Let's just do a bit more go in the right directions. We'll go as fast as we can, but we're not going to change the way we live, which is what the people in tragedy discourse want. We will invest to some extent in the technologies that might dig us out the hole. So that's the kind of thing that comes through from those kinds of discussions, and that is very much the attitude that sits within government at the moment. So let me turn now from what I would call the chronic emergencies that we have to potentially deal with to the acute emergencies. And I mean, you could call COVID-19 an acute emergency or a chronic emergency. I think it's kind of halfway in between. But the kind of acute emergencies that I've been involved with in the past are things like the Novichok poisoning in Salisbury. I had responsibility for all the cleanup in Salisbury afterwards, and for assuring that Salisbury was clean and could go back into public use. But I've also been involved in other emergencies on flooding, for example, and various other things as well. Now, what I've put in here is a diagram showing how we deal with this in the UK. And this is really a slight diversion from the kind of central theme of the talk, but I just thought it would be interesting to you because it's so topical at the moment about how we deal with emergencies. And this committee called SAGE, the Science Advisory Group for Emergencies, which I have sat on through the COVID-19 emergency. And just to explain how SAGE works and how the emergency response works. You will all have heard of COBRA. COBRA is not a snake, it's the Cabinet Office briefing room. And it's where most of the key decisions are made, and it's a ministerial or prime ministerially chaired group. SAGE actually reports to COBRA, and it responds to questions from COBRA. That is why SAGE exists. There's also a civil and military response structure as well, which also feeds into COBRA. So this is what you see in response on the ground. So this guy here, who's in a hazard suit, trying to avoid getting poisoned by Novichok, sits within this command structure, and that feeds into COBRA. But this structure is managing or is responding, not managing, but is responding when national risks occur. But underlying it is a continuous process of trying to understand where those risks are, assess them, and make adjustments to them. I've listed some of them here. There's about 30 to 40 national risks on the National Risk Register, and that's accompanied by something called the National Risk Assessment, which is actually a secret document. It's got terrorism risks, it's got nuclear risks, food system failure risks, pandemics, like we've just had, coastal flooding, and pandemics, for example, you know, there can be lots of different flavors of pandemics, coastal flooding, seismic volcanic activity, transport system failures, major dam bursts, industrial explosions. Those sorts of things are the kind of risks that exist. Those are the acute risks that are managed through this process. Clearly, with COVID-19, it didn't really work very well. I mean, it worked. I think it worked. Eventually, it worked quite well. But the reality was that we weren't as prepared for a pandemic as we probably should have been, despite the fact that this whole system is exercised continuously by government, even in peacetime. In other words, when there is no emergency going on. And most of the SAGEs that I've been involved with have been SAGEs that have been practicing emergencies rather than dealing with real emergencies. But nevertheless, that is the structure that exists. And I'll come back to sort of how I think we need to modify that in due course in order to be more resilient. Again, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I know that there's been a huge amount of actually misunderstanding about what SAGE has been there to do. And I want to be slightly defensive about this, I have to say, because it's not often that scientists get a chance to really defend themselves properly, because I think there's been quite a lot of misinformation about SAGE. And I've listed here all the things that SAGE does, also the things it does not do, many of which I think the public assumed that it did do, and certainly the press assumed that it did do. And I'll just go through some of these. It doesn't exist when there's no emergency. A SAGE is created and molded around the emergency. So the specific expertise that is needed for an emergency is brought in specifically to create a SAGE which is designed for that emergency. It does not have a duty to be public facing. In other words, it does not have any duty to report its deliberations to the public. Now, you can argue that that's wrong, and it's possible that it is wrong. But the reality is that a lot of the upset that there was during COVID-19 about what's SAGE talking about, and what's SAGE saying, we're not hearing anything from them, is just because actually SAGE is not set up to do that at all. It doesn't think up policy or operational options. It is not a policy committee. It is just a committee of scientists who are looking at the evidence and coming up with advice based on that evidence. It doesn't commission research. It doesn't discuss politics. I think that's the hardest thing for a lot of the press to grasp, that during the height of an emergency, you can get a bunch of intelligent people around a table who don't talk about the politics around the emergency. We just don't do that. We talk about the science associated with it. So, with Novichok, for example, it was entirely about, what are the lethal dose rates? All those sorts of things are talked about, but we're not talking about the relationship between the UK and Russia and those sorts of things. That's for other people to deal with. And similarly with COVID-19, it wasn't about, when should the country shut down or when should it not. We simply produce advice based on what are the different options and what are the consequences of those options. And then it's for others to make decisions. We don't take any ideological position. So we could work just as easily with a left-wing government as a right-wing government, or whatever it might be, or a religious minority, or whatever it is. We don't also take account of all scientific perspectives. You heard other scientists talking during the COVID-19, perfectly legitimate, but it's impossible in the fast-moving situation in an emergency, even during COVID-19, to take everybody's opinion into account. What you do is you distill down the best you can from the opinions you have around the table, and you put around the table the best people in the country, the most knowledgeable people in the country, to come up with the advice. And finally, and quite difficult sometimes, you don't get emotionally involved in it. So, you know, people are dying. It's quite difficult not to get emotionally involved with these sorts of things, but you must not do that. It's got to be a clear and objective judgment that one is making. Anyway, that's a slight diversion. Let me just sort of move to heading off the crisis now. And this comes back to the work that I've done around resilience, particularly with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And what we want to do is try to reduce the frequency and impact of events by creating resilience in the communities. In other words, when things go wrong, we want communities, first of all, you know, ideally, just not even to notice, because actually, if they don't notice, then they're resilient. And you know, resilience is defined, in my view, as the capacity to respond, to take corrective action when stressed. And sometimes when we're stressed, we don't even know we're taking corrective action. I actually have a background in physiology, and everybody is stressed all the time, but we don't notice it because actually we have resilience within our bodily systems. And it's the same with environmental resilience as well. And there are certain attributes that resilience has. And I talked about scale, I talked about from individuals to households to local communities to local government to national government. And these attributes work at all those scales. And so what you could do, in fact, I did an interview earlier today about resilience in businesses. What you can do is take these attributes and you can tick them off against your own particular circumstances. So what I would say is that you could take these attributes and use them in a local community situation, a royal borough, whatever it might be, and you can actually make an assessment of your level of resilience against these kind of attributes. So what I'll do is quickly just go through these attributes. The first one is high diversity. Now that's diversity in all senses. You know, I think that if you, but I'll illustrate it in a kind of mechanistic sense, in that if you are a business with a single supplier, you have a single point of failure. And that single point of failure may well be your comeuppance in the end, if that failure actually happens. Similarly, if you're a business and you have one big customer and that customer goes bust or whatever it might be, you don't have resilience. So diversity is really important, and it's about social diversity as well. It's about taking in lots of different opinions, for example, too. So there's so you can have huge amounts of resilience just by being more diverse. Something that's fairly obvious, or should be fairly obvious, is that we need spare capacity. Originally, I called this redundancy, but people said that's not a good word to use because actually there are social connotations to redundancy. But I'm using it in a technical sense, in that any system needs spare capacity to be able to flex, to adapt in order to adapt to particular circumstances. And you know, we've witnessed that in COVID-19 with the lack of spare capacity within the NHS in particular. But we also drive out spare capacity systematically through driving in economic efficiency. So just-in-time supply chains are a classic tool for driving in economic efficiency. In other words, businesses or whatever it is don't have much stock. They don't have a large inventory, and they order things out and then move them on just as quickly as possible. And our food system is a just-in-time supply system. I think something like a third of all our food is on the road at any one time. maybe a bit more than that actually. But the reality is that we don't have, well, this country probably has maybe a couple of weeks worth of food. But actually we'd see shortages within about 4 days if the food supply started to fall over. So we don't have much spare capacity at all. The next attribute is connectivity. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that, you know, again, in a technical sense, in the UK, we get resilience in our electrical supply system by having connectivity through interconnectors into the continental grid. But we can do that at a social level as well. If you're a local government and you're short of road salt in the wintertime, you can always be connected to other local governments who might be able to loan you some road salt. So it's kind of things like that, you know, one needs to think through one's own circumstances and say, well, actually, can I connect to others in order to be able to be more resilient and make them more resilient at the same time? So it's about sharing problems and sharing resources at times of difficulty. And then inclusiveness, equity, and fairness. I think, you know, this is quite it's quite at the soft end of the attributes, but it's really important because, you know, one of the things my wife said to me when I started talking to her about resilience when I was going on to the Post-COVID Futures Commission was that she just said, well, it starts at individuals, doesn't it? And she's absolutely right. It's about creating resilient individuals, and we do that by valuing them, and that's about inclusiveness, equity, and fairness. In a business, if you've been unfair to employees, they're not going to pull out all the stops when things get tough for you. But you know, if you've been fair and they have high loyalty to you, then they will. So that's just an illustration of why inclusive equity and fairness is really important. Adaptation is important as well. In other words, are we learning from our experiences? So, you know, every time something goes wrong, even small things, we've got to learn from those experiences. And health and safety is a classic case of the implementation of adaptation, where we have near miss reporting, and near miss reporting, if we do it well, reduces the number of accidents, because actually we learn from those near misses and we make modifications to what we do and we become more resilient as a result. And then finally, preparedness. And that's about foresighting, in other words, looking ahead. It's about understanding what our risks are. And of course, you know, I've talked about some of the risks already, and making sure that you, as much as you can, you understand what they are and that you make appropriate preparations. And of course, you know, with COVID-19, we weren't really prepared. We didn't have the PPE ready in the NHS or in businesses or anything like that. The next emergency probably won't be like COVID-19, but you know, are we looking ahead to what that might be, and are we making preparations? I think overall, probably the answer to that is no. So they're the attributes, and so you know, what should we actually do? Well, apart from looking at those attributes and trying to respond to them and make sure that we can tick them off as best we can. Certainly at a national scale, but I think even at a local scale, we need risk registers, and of course local risk registers can be subsets of national risk registers, and we need to be able to do risk assessments. Now I know that local government does this a lot, and probably does it pretty well. But one of the problems with some of the risk assessments that we have at the moment, and particularly the national risk assessment, which, as I said, is actually a secret document, is that we don't tell anybody about it. So one of the reasons why we weren't resilient to COVID-19 was that although people like me knew something like that was very likely to happen, we weren't actually communicating it to people. So, you know, how are people going to be prepared if they don't know what is in the offing? And we do need to change that very substantially in the future. In fact, if there was one thing I had to change as a result of COVID-19, it would be that. It would be to be much, much more honest with the public about where the risks lie, because these risks, as I've already mentioned, are substantial. They're chronic risks and they're acute risks. And then once you do that, you can then start to have conversations about the allocation of responsibility for risk and risk management. These are difficult conversations for people to have, but different parts of society must know what their duty is. We talk about rights in society. Everybody has rights, but actually people have obligations as well. So that's the opposite side of the rights coin, is that there are obligations. And part of that obligation is to be aware of what one's responsibilities are, whether as an individual, household, local business, local government, national institution, big corporate, or national government. What are everybody's responsibilities to become resilient? And then I think we need to measure and assess progress. I'm a scientist, so I like to measure things, but I think it's really important that we know how resilient we are. And then we need to mainstream this. In other words, we need to make sure it is embedded right across our governing systems. And that's not just central government, it's all the local government structures, it's the parish councils, it's all the other bits as well. So everybody needs to be understanding of this and moving in that direction. And then sort of this is my last slide. So just to come back to the question that was, or the exam question I was given, how can a 21st century market town be sustainable to the benefit of all? Well, I've listed off what I think are some of the things that need to be done. I think that the community itself needs to understand and agree the challenges, and I've talked about some of those. What are the shocks? They will be different for different geographical locations. Cupar has a river running through it, so flooding is going to be a potential issue. I know it is an issue sometimes, but you have to be inclusive in terms of decision making, and I think it's really important that the silent voice is heard. And that's a really difficult one. We listen to the people who say a lot of the time and who get involved, but there's a lot of silent voices out there, and they count just as much. Deal with the challenges systematically and with determination. And I've given some ideas about how you do that. But the really important thing is the long-term nature of this. This isn't something to do just for a year or 2 years or even 5 years. This is something that needs to get totally embedded and just becomes part of the way of life. Develop local solutions with an eye on national relevance. So we all need to, this is about connectivity really again, we need to learn from everybody else's experience. And I know from having spoke to Bill that a lot is going on in Cupar about that as well, which is really excellent, it's wonderful. And understand obviously how those local solutions are embedded within that national context, because it's really important to connect upwards in the system as well as downwards in the system. And by doing that, you also influence the national agenda. So it's important to try and get the national agenda to align with your agenda if you possibly can do. And then finally, again, measure your progress. I'm just going to turn to this diagram on the left, give you an idea of how their challenges are articulated in the context that I'm dealing with, which is, as Bill said, the University of St Andrews, trying to get University of St Andrews to net zero. This is a pie chart showing the amount of carbon that the university emits in different parts of its business. The actual labels here don't matter too much, but basically construction, electricity, heating, water is down here. So the right hand of this diagram, all the bits over here are the kind of things that if you said to somebody, well, what do we need to do to reduce carbon? They're the kind of things that people would talk about. It's about heating. It's about making sure our buildings are insulated. It's about reducing the amount of electricity you use and those sorts of things. But you'll see that these are the smallest pies in the diagram, or some of the smallest pieces of pie in the diagram. So we could work very hard on reducing those. But over here is where all the damage is really happening. And those two pieces of pie are procurement and travel. And both of those are about changing behaviors. So we can do all we like with engineering structures and all the other things. Actually, the real challenge is about changing people's attitudes and changing people's behaviors to buy more smart, probably travel less, but certainly to travel smart. And if they don't do that, these pieces of pie are not going to get any smaller. And that's the big challenge we have, getting the university to sustainability. But the point is that sometimes the most obvious things that people say are the solutions are not actually, and you need to analyze your situation. And that's why I've given you that list of attributes. I think you need to analyze that in order to understand where your vulnerabilities lie and what you can do about them. And with that, thank you very much indeed for your attention. And I've probably gone on too long. I apologize.
Ian, thank you. That was an absolute tour de force, as I knew it would be. We've had some questions, but some of them came in early on, and I think you've answered some of them. I mean, one, for example, was a question about what you would get government to instruct in the way of research to try to aim off for the next crisis, commenting that the Treasury designed almost overnight a well-bleeding furlough scheme, and the scientific community produced the COVID vaccines. Is there anything at all that you could give to government to say to them, these are the things you really ought to be asking scientists and others to work on in the future?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to be too specific because actually, I think we need to do the analysis where the vulnerabilities really sit, and also understand what science can do in order to be able to, or potentially what science can do in order to be able to alleviate these, because some of these vulnerabilities may be managed through bureaucratic processes. But let's just take vaccines, for example, or let's take pandemics rather than vaccines. I think we could be much more targeted about how we invest in vaccines, particularly in vaccines, but also in some other therapeutics, which don't necessarily address the problem of a particular type of pathogen, a particular virus, because there are lots out there. We could design, we could spend all our resources just designing vaccines for all the different viruses that there are that could cause us problems, and we just can't do that. But what we can do is ensure we have what you call the generic capability. So one of the reasons why the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was produced so quickly was because they had created essentially a scaffolding of a kind of virus that they could put the protein on that created the antigen protein on that created the vaccine, which produced an immune response. So we could do a lot more of that. But it comes back to what is the basic science we need to do. And for example, with food, my view is that we need to deconstruct how we produce food back to transferring photons from light into carbohydrates. And we need to look at that chemically so that we can actually, rather than growing food in future, we actually manufacture food. Now, it could look the same on the plate, but the reality is that we need to make that at least 5 times, maybe even 10 times more efficient by the middle of the century. And the only way of doing that is to actually take the process back to basics and try to rebuild it chemically from the bottom up.
Thank you, Ian.
I could go on about that for quite a while.
I don't doubt you for a moment. I think we've got time for just one other question. You mentioned in the context of the university, and others have been, of course, worldwide talking about net zero. Is there any possibility of ever achieving gross zero, is the question. And if so, where do you see the negative emission technologies appearing?
I don't think we'll ever achieve gross zero. I mean, I think we're always going to be using carbon in some way or other and emitting it into the atmosphere, and we have to then balance that off or net it off using absorption technologies. Sorry, Bill, I missed the second part of the question. Was it about technologies?
Yes. Yeah, so where do you see the negative emission technologies appearing,
okay,
if in fact these technologies are going to be available?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are probably no technologies that are truly negative emissions. I think carbon capture and storage is one, but some people say that's just like landfill. You're taking your problem and you're putting it in the ground. I don't think it's quite like that. But I think there are some negative emission technologies, but actually most of them are positive, and then you have to offset them with technologies that are absorbing carbon, and that can be anything as simple as growing forests or peats or seagrass communities or something like that, all the way through to absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, splitting carbon dioxide and turning it into something that you can then store away, or else you reuse it as a fuel of some description. Most of these things are possible. It's just that we need to be able to scale them up and make them economic. And with the carbon price the way it is at the moment, they're not economic, unfortunately.
Ian, thank you for that. Very reluctantly, I think I'm going to have to bring the Q&A to a close and ask Ewan MacLeod, please, to give the vote of thanks to our very learned, very interesting speaker. Ewan, please.
Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ewan MacLeod. I sit on a number of boards of charities and community interest companies in and around Cupar, and it's very interested to hear exactly how instrumental the communities must be in this sort of field. I have the privilege of giving the vote of thanks, and mainly to all of those that made this happen tonight. And that's not just Ian, who's given an absolutely phenomenal lecture to us, but also I'd like to thank and highlight people such as Bill Pagan and Simon Baldwin, who's actually made this happen both physically and virtually over the course of the last few weeks. We've been working on this, and instrumental in making the event exactly what it is. Sir Ian has delivered an immensely thought-provoking lecture, in part scary. I think he mentioned to us that he could actually scare the pants off us, and I think possibly he has in parts. But most importantly, I think it has been incredibly educational and informative. I know that I am going to use in my talks in the future the scale-free complex processes that I actually have in place now that I've got a new phrase that I can use. And although Sir Ian said that he felt that he didn't really have an awful lot to say about communities, I think his last slide absolutely emphasized the fact that resilience starts and ends with communities, and communities have to be at the heart of that, building the resilience. And I think that's absolutely key. I think that a key point that I also took away is that historically it's been short-term decision making, and what we really need is longer term solutions. And I think that's going to be obviously something that the government is focusing on in the future, and so should we as a very, very close community here. So I would just like to thank Sir Ian absolutely for a phenomenal talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And once again, I would just like to thank everyone who's been involved with this, including everybody who's attended tonight to listen to this. Normally, I would suggest that we all give our vote of thanks in the normal fashion, but unfortunately in the virtual world, we don't really have that. Although if you do wish to click on the little reactions icon at the bottom of your screen, you can click on a little hand clap, which you can then add to your screen. So please feel free to do that and give Sir Ian the thanks that he most absolutely deserves.
Ian, thank you very much for that. Thank you very, very much for that. I'm now about to bring the whole event to a close, but I'll make two announcements, if I may, please, about the future. First of all, with governments saying they wish to empower communities and to harness the energies of communities, and with local place plans and community planning coming on stream in 2022, the subject of next year's Cupar and District annual lecture will be the contributions that inclusive local communities can make to health and well-being. And the second announcement is that CDT's next online event is the AGM talk on 30th November, when Ewan Leach, formerly Chief Executive of the Built Environment Forum Scotland and now of Scotland's Urban Regeneration Forum, will address us on some of the other challenges facing a small market town. And I now have sadness, I think, to say in bringing this event to a close, but with thanks to you all for having been with us, and of course renewed thanks to Ian and to Simon, our Zoom host, organizer, guide and friend. Thank you all very much for being with us. Good night.
Mm-hmm.